Welcome on this Monday morning. It's really awesome to see you all already here in Innsbruck. The panels start at lunchtime, so it's even more exciting to kick off this week with some data discussion. I think it's one thing to have exciting research question, and all of you have plenty of these, but it's also really exciting if we find a data source that helps us answering these questions. And the internet and new technological tools really allow us to find new sorts of data. And these sorts of data are often very exciting. They are large, but they are often produced for another purpose than the purpose we are working with the data. So the data is unstructured, messy, noisy, whatever challenges you can come up with, you will find them in terms of, as we call it in this panel, big data, but we will clarify the term later on. So what we mean in essence is really data that was not produced for the purpose of our research question. It was produced for something else, but the panelists will tell you more how they see the term big data or the new type of data that we have nowadays. So along these lines, in this panel, we're going to discuss new opportunities, exciting events that we can use this new sort of data, but also a lot of challenges that come up and where we need to pay attention to as researchers. So with this, we hope that this Monday kickoff helps us to start an exciting ECPR week, and Dominik will introduce our great panelists that have really different perspectives and angles to the questions.
Thank you, Lisa, and good morning to everyone. So whenever we have an emerging data source coming up, an emerging methods or emerging research questions, and we don't know what's what, we probably better ask the people who are working with it deeply in particular, and that's true for our three colleagues here, think deeply about the method itself. So we're very happy to have Alexandra Segerberg here at the very end. She is an associate professor of political science at Uppsala University and got her PhD in political science from the University of Stockholm. And she's published very widely in political communication, social movements, collective action. Why she's here, and that's particularly interesting for us, is our pathway through the research method. So she has done case study work to think very in-depth about question. And in recent years, done a lot of work with digital data. So we can say she has thought deep and big, small and large about research methods. Thank you for being here. Then we have Julia Schulte-Cloos here. She is currently the Robert Schumann Fellow at the University Institute in Florence, where she also got her PhD. And I believe she has accepted the offer to come to Innsbruck because our university sometimes makes very good decisions, in addition to being placed in the most beautiful landscape. But this was also brilliant. And she works on political behavior, political identities and populism. The reason why she is here in particularly, or that's what we thought, is because Julia thinks very deeply about reproducibility. And these are questions certainly arising with big data, questions about privacy, questions about proprietary data, questions about research ethics. And I'm very happy that she's here as well. And last year, ECPR also recognized her talent and awarded her with the Rising Star Award in 2021. So hi, Julia, and thanks for being here. And then we got Kevin Munger here, and here I have to read this out because he comes with the fanciest title. So he's the Jeffrey L. Hyde and Sharon D. Hyde and Political Science Board of Visitors Early Career Professor of Political Science and Assistant Professor of Political Science and Social Data Analytics at the Pennsylvania State University. Brilliant branding. Thank you. And he writes substantively on political communication, on political behavior, but in particular, wherever it touches the digital world. So use of social media data, the data that we're using to understand substantive questions that are coming from the digital. When you hook onto his Twitter feed, you learn very quickly that he really does not like the boomer generation. So he has also written on the age gap in the use of the internet. So all very interesting. One particular reason why he is here is because he pointed out in recent years with a few colleagues, again, the description is something that is very important, and political science in many cases has taken a turn to inference, very much inference-based questions, causal inference-based questions. And he, as a co-founder of the Journal for Quantitative Description, for example, very much highlights that learning about the world through description is very important. So thanks for being here, and we're going to get started with a first question.
No, I think we're going to kick off with some introductory remarks by our panelists. They all have different perspectives and different angles they are coming from. So, Alexandra, would you like to start?
So thank you very much for putting this panel together with such excellent colleagues. I want to use my opening minutes and answering the questions that you sent us in advance by pointing to reasons why political science really should engage seriously with what we're in this panel today calling the big data paradigm, no matter what we think of it, and beyond the circle of those most seriously and intensely involved in doing big data work. Big data clearly presents opportunities, equally clearly challenges for political research, and the stakes are intensifying in the era of artificial intelligence. Just before the panel, we were, this roundtable, we were talking about how the actual term big data might be dated, but how it now is becoming increasingly, it's sort of come back. It was something that I personally thought would sort of fade, but then it's come back with a vengeance now that artificial intelligence is really penetrating so deeply into society. And where the big data discussion becomes relevant again. So to start with what I mean by big data, to be honest, I'm not particularly invested in one particular definition. And in fact, one of the inspiring things, I think, is how varied the field is, how varied the data is that we now can get at. And so there are family resemblances, but we're actually pulling in quite a lot here. I am one of those who thinks that it's very difficult to disentangle the data, the very rich, complex, large-scale data from the methods that we're having to use to extract it, to collect it, to reduce it, to organize it, analyze it, and archive it. You know, there's a lot of work in that, and that also needs to be part of the discussion, I think. So when I'm talking about big data research, I mean that whole package, the whole shebang. And I also think that part of what we need to deal with is the big data paradigm, which includes the narratives around it, around the data, and around the machine learning methods and the AI-based methods that come along with it. So I think that there are three quite different reasons why it's crucial for us as a discipline and as a scholarly community to engage really earnestly with big data, despite the pitfalls and sometimes because of the pitfalls that we see, even when many of us may never actually do the more detailed research ourselves. And these points have to do with relevance, with rejuvenation, and with resistance, I think. So first, I think it's important to point out that one of the reasons big data research is so crucial is that in some cases, we really couldn't capture the phenomena that we're trying to study in other ways. And because of that, we would, if we didn't do it, have fewer resources to analyze our societies in transformation. And this is a very basic point. It's obvious, but it's a point worth making because we sometimes talk as though big data is just an indulgence, or especially from people outside of it, that it's something we do because now we have the data, so we go do the research. But it's not about the data always itself, even though I think it opens creativity. To take a very brief example from disinformation studies, it turns out that coordinated link sharing online by a large number of disparate accounts and dispersed accounts at the same time within a couple of seconds can be a marker of persuasive activity. In this case, you really do need a big data design to get at these patterns. And it's not something you could capture if you just went in through the individual accounts and looked at their attributes and their actions. So that's an example. So for some, the research problem will drive you, if you're open to it, will drive you into big data research. And for the discipline, this is important for striving for relevance and traction on rapidly transforming societies, because it brings at least a piece of the puzzle, even if it's not enough in itself. The second thing I would say is that I think we should recognize this as a moment and opportunity for rejuvenation in the discipline, not a revolution, but a rejuvenation. One of the single most interesting things about the big data thing for me is how it challenges us to actually do our job, what we're trained for. Now that there are alternatives for how we can approach something and sources that we can find something in, we really have to think about why we're doing it in a particular way and why we might continue to do things in the way we've been doing them, or to seek out an alternative. A lot of the debates that we have and we might have today are circling around old questions that are at the core of our profession, and about testing our assumptions about the data, and the world, and thinking about what we're trying to get at, why we're trying to get at it like that, what we can actually say with it, what the systematic flaws are. And it's injecting these old questions that our students think are, so boring with new urgency. So I think we should embrace this. This is also a juncture where it's a natural opportunity to move beyond methodological divides in our discipline, to the extent that they're still there. Big data is sometimes assumed, especially by those from the outside, to be an exclusively quantitative domain. But this tends to overlook the degree to which the conceptual, manual, and interpretive work is needed in this work. For example, in building really robust machine learning-based design and methodology along the entire pipeline. We already have a lot of experience and skills within our discipline that are called for now. They're spread out. We can do a lot more with integrating and bringing in contributions from different parts of this discipline, but also pushing further into interdisciplinary efforts within the behavioral sciences, but also then beyond into, for example, computer science, but not buying into everything, of course. Because this is a juncture and we're fairly early on in this type of work, it's also in a juncture where we need to think about the implications of divides that are emerging because of structures that we set early on. So big data and the type of work around it requires lots of resources, skills, access to data that might be, that are unevenly spread. What does this mean for us as a community and a discipline? But also more subtly, thinking about built-in biases that are there in the infrastructures that we are now have at the very early on, and might set path dependencies about things that we study, but also for some of our sort of results. I'm thinking of things like the infrastructures in the tools that we're using. So for text analysis, being premised on English, for example, and image analysis, pre-trained networks, or training networks on data sets that are composed on and premised on Western industrialized cultures. That's the sort of thing I'm thinking of. This not only risks creating biases in the analyses, but might actually make them less useful for some scholars for what they're trying to get at. So they might avoid these pathways. So this might sort of build in path dependencies that we need to be aware of. Finally, for want of a better word, this is important for the discipline for resistance. It's important to say, I think, and really appreciate that our struggles, we're all struggling with lots of parts of this, the big data methodologies, trying to make them fit for political research. These struggles, I think, have a value for society that goes beyond the results themselves. Now, data is more available to us, but it's even more available to others now. And that's the really revolutionary thing. Big data are increasingly being used by the state and by other actors to do a lot of things, to produce knowledge and facts and knowledge about society, to build systems on that, to ground decisions on that, and sometimes to go further and manipulate and persuade and so on. As professionals in this business, we should make sure that the discipline is well equipped to objectively assess and monitor that kind of knowledge and those processes. And I think to do that, we really need to understand these processes ourselves. We should not, as a discipline, underestimate how developing and demonstrating a robust understanding of what can go wrong, the pitfalls, and also develop the necessary protocols and that sort of thing. So that puts us into a position to play the important role that we can play to that end.
Thank you for this very inspiring introduction and for raising so many important points. I think we're gonna go back into the discussion to plenty of these. So Julia, would you like to kick off your ideas?
Yeah, so thank you very much for kicking this off, Alexandra. So we were asked to define big data, and I can very much echo what Alexandra just said. It's very hard to come up with a definition of big data that is not dated, as big data as a terminology might be already quite dated. So most broadly, I would say big data or it's easier to come up with a negative definition maybe and define what's not big data, and that's maybe any data that can be analyzed by means of traditional data processing software. So I think the terminology is changing continuously, and what I would hope that we will be speaking in our discussion today as well is that in the age of AI and deep learning, as Alexandra has already highlighted, data can also turn big, right? So when we augment traditional data through neural networks and classifiers, it can turn big by by the dimensions that we add to the data. When it comes to the role of big data in advancing our scientific knowledge in political science, I will leave the floor to Kevin to speak about the importance of observational evidence and descriptive evidence. And generating such evidence, which I think is the central importance that the big data, as we see now, takes. But then for our discussion, I would be hoping also that we could speak a bit more about the generative role of AI and big data. So for the time being, synthetic data is mostly a subject of research in political science, but it could also turn into a tool for research. So that could, for instance, be if we develop specific, we could call it granular or personalized treatments. So we use the large existing observational variation that we observe in the social world to generate treatments that are very much tailored to individuals' micro context, and that could be digital, that could also be real world micro context. So we generate, in a sense, we draw from the information we observe, and that helps us to design treatments, and these treatments could also be generated by relying on synthetic data. So for instance, when it comes to generating images that we would like to expose respondents to, or also text material, which of course has the huge advantage that we can have experimental control over a number of features that we couldn't necessarily control if we rely on real world text or real world images. So then some challenges that I see in the field as it is now, that we might also come back to in the discussion. I think Dominik in his introduction already mentioned the issue of computational reproducibility with large amounts of data. And what I see, or what I personally identify as a huge deficit currently in the discipline and the training of the discipline, is that we hardly teach students about containerization. So how we can ship basically our, for instance, replication packages in a way that allows really any research in the future with any type of machine to reproduce the data. So we need to, in a sense, package the exact versioning of the software environment that we have used to obtain our results, and ship this and allow others, even with a different machine, with a different software environment, to reproduce the results. And that is increasingly becoming relevant, especially as technology develops, right? So we become more dependent on the specific snapshot of moment in time at which we conducted our analysis. Another challenge that I identify is the large use of surveys and also survey experiments in political science that is hardly documented. So what I would like to see the discipline to evolve to is to treat survey as code, so that we don't, in a sense, like the way many survey experiments are designed now, it's very hard to reproduce them or to add another feature to it, because we would have to go manually through the process of actually designing the survey through a user interface, right? So my vision of this, also in terms of advancing scientific knowledge, is that we can actually, write survey as code, and thereby help other researchers to easily follow up or take up some of our survey experiments. I think the ethics dimension of certain AI models, black box models, we think about GPT-3 has already been mentioned, so I'll leave that. And I think, yeah, that's it from my side, and I think Kevin will add some more.
All right. Thanks for being here. Unfortunately, I agree pretty much with everything that's been said, so I'm going to try to amplify the areas in which I disagree. So I think the first question is, do we feel like social science is going well? Have we done a good job? I think something I've come to see is that what I see as what I'm doing, which I would describe as behavioral science, is in fact quite young. It is roughly 70 years old. So we haven't been working on these problems for very long. And thus far, I would not say that we have come to the kind of large-scale theories of behavior which we would like to have as a mature science. And so reading the history of science, there's this interplay between the development of theories and the development of new instruments. And big data clearly is a new instrument. So there's a quote from sociologist Robert Merton that says, "Perhaps the reason sociology does not have an Einstein yet is because we don't yet have a Kepler. That is, Kepler described the motion of the planets, which was a necessary first step before we were able to get Einstein's theory of relativity." And I think that to date, the social world, the scope of human behavior that we're trying to study, has remained very dimly illuminated by the methods that we have. So Duncan Watts says that we now have our telescope in the form of computational data. Possibly that's correct, but I think that in order to take advantage of this, we're going to require a full-scale reorientation of how we do social science. So Alexandra said she's looking for rejuvenation, and I think I might go farther and say we do need a revolution. So when I see the young people, when I see grad students, they tend to be much more teched up. They have a lot more of these skills that we now think are necessary for doing what I now call computational social science, which I think is a useful term to describe the descendant of behavioral science, which exists in econ, poli-sci, psychology, sociology. And so the institutions that we've inherited might well not be the right ones for the task which we could now approach given the new instruments that we have. So that was my motivation for founding this Journal of Quantitative Description, which I think the goal is to highlight this task as necessary in the process of knowledge generation. So to date, we have outsourced certain intuitive understandings of the world to other social institutions like the media or our own intuitive experience of what we're studying. And I think that that's no longer sufficient. So one of the complements of big data is sort of big social world. Like the internet and the associated technologies have radically expanded the scope of behavior that we're trying to explain. In addition to the fact that there's now just way more people, there's a lot more freedom in the world, and thus a lot more complexity of what we're trying to understand. So when I look at the study of social media and politics over the past decade, I would say we haven't done a very good job. And the reason, I think, is that we haven't necessarily been asking the right questions. So when I think about the topics that have dominated the study of social media to date, they tend to be driven by crises in the media. So misinformation, fake news takes off in 2015, and that is put on our academic agenda. And the questions that we're supposed to be asking are, what does fake news do? How do we fight it, right? It's possible these are just not very good questions. And I think that part of why we accept these questions is that they are good questions from our perspective. Another example here is echo chambers. Right, the problem of online echo chambers has been one of the dominant conversations in the study of social media ever since it started. And thanks to a lot of very rigorous research, descriptive and otherwise, I would summarize the claim about where we are with echo chambers as echo chambers are worse in the real world than online. That is, the homophily that drives what we see on the internet is actually much stronger before the internet, in terms of I was sitting with my family and talking about politics. And it turns out they have even more in common with me about politics than does whatever I opt into and then algorithmically get fed on the internet. The exception to this rule appears to be people in specialized communities like academics. So we are in echo chambers, and that is why we intuitively think that echo chambers explain a lot of the behavior on social media. And so that's why I think that description, quantitative description, is a necessary first step to start asking the right questions. And part of this is to the point of resistance. I really like this phrase. I think it's going to require rethinking ethics. So the idea of consent is something we'd usually like to have when we're understanding people's behavior. On the internet, they've opted in to their behavior being studied. That's explicitly in the terms of service, but I don't think the terms of service really mean anything. But it's clear that people expect to be observed when they tweet things. If anything, they want to be observed. That's the point. And so using these inherited ethical frameworks about, well, we can't study these things because we don't have consent, because that's handed down from on high as the ethics, is incorrect. And the point of resistance, I think, is right. We have an ethical obligation to use these tools. So the question is not whether human behavior, data about human behavior will be gathered at scale. The question is, will anybody outside of corporations or state security agencies have access to that data? And I think the answer has to be yes. And we are best positioned as actors in society to make that happen.
Thanks so much for these great introductions. And it's also really nice to see how joint questions were raised by all of the panelists. I want to start with more general, but also somehow practical insights from your side. So I think, as Kevin just put out, we are, as a discipline, in a flux, so many different things floating around. We don't really have something pinned down yet, and the world becomes at the same time more complex, also maybe to some degree more available to us in terms of data. And Alexandra has pointed it out that big data really poses new urgencies for us. So I wondered, how can we as researchers work in this difficult situation? So we have flux, complexity, but we also need to do something about it. So how can we move forward to gain new insights, or do we want to first move forward in order to answer old questions with a new perspective? So I wonder how you would suggest that our next steps as a discipline, as a researcher, are. What should we do? Also in terms of maybe more pinning it down, like Kevin, maybe we can start with your descriptive process. How can we do you suggest an inductive process that we raise new questions, or how would we start?
Sure. Yeah, I do frankly endorse the inductive approach, mostly because we just don't have any idea what's out there. The idea of having a deductive hypothesis without understanding what the world is, I mean, we have to tack back and forth between deduction and induction, I think. And I think that at the margin that we're at right now, we don't have much reason to be doing deductive theory testing about online behavior. I think that there's another perspective, which is that online or big data in general gives us insight into theories of offline behavior, which I think do have good reason to continue to use from the past. But when it comes to how people use the internet, I think we are not anywhere close to understanding what's going on. And so part of this is, so what drove me to do the journal in particular is that I started out doing experiments on the internet, on Twitter, for example. And I basically realized that the idea of replication doesn't make sense. So to try to do the experiment again 2 or 3 years later was literally impossible because Twitter had changed the way that they enforced their rules against bots. And so if we were going to insist on the idea of replication as necessary for science, we can't really be using these methods. And I think that, you know, if we have to choose between the two, I will abandon the idea of replication as the cornerstone of science. But the descriptive approach is helpful because it is cheaper. So the scope of the behavior we're trying to study is very, very large and changing very quickly. And setting up data pipelines where we can run the same descriptive analysis, scrape the same data, and then analyze how it changes over time is a very good first step and is something that we can do with the scope of social science as it exists today. And frankly, the world continues to change. It continues to offer up new things that happen. And if we have these baseline descriptives, we can then try to figure out what the effect of whatever the world does on our measures are, right? So think about climate change, right? We needed to have the descriptive measures of ice in order to measure the effect of climate change. So I'm saying that we need to spend a significant percentage of our energies as social scientists studying human behavior on the internet on that baseline descriptive step. And having just developing more methods for doing this, raising the status of this kind of work within the discipline, I think will continue to push this forward.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? So did you have meta-analysis already in the Journal of Quantitative Description? Because what I imagine is like, I very much agree with you, but what I imagine is that we will, in the end of the day, as new platforms emerge, we will accumulate a lot of knowledge on the specifics of each platform, right? But we might also need something that brings together the existing studies and reviews them, like a meta-analysis, to generate or to detect commonalities, right? And that, in a sense, link that back to our offline theories and see kind of how they speak to each other. I don't know, what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, so we have a special issue that we are going to announce soon about meta-science in the journal. So the scope is digital media. And thankfully, I think that all of our research papers falls under digital media, and they're PDFs on the internet, so that counts. So yes, we do want to be doing this kind of thing. The concern is that we want to ask the question of, let's say, does using Facebook increase political knowledge, right? And if we have a series of studies from 2010 to 2022 about this question, we're kind of assuming that the word Facebook is capturing some sufficiently stable thing in the world that it makes sense to compare. I don't think it does, which is a real problem for the entire paradigm of accumulating knowledge about a topic, which is a bigger problem.
We step from problem to problem, right, in this area. Also, Alexandra, maybe you could, just to add on the introduction, I found it really triggering that you said we have a new urgency out there. Could you speak more to that, what you mean, and like the big data produces a new urgency for us as researchers?
I think two things. I think that the one is that this rapidly changing or sort of society that is highly with the integration of digitalization. We're both digital media and politics scholars, so this is a natural example. It's about online discourse and online what's happening online, but it's penetrating very deeply into society. So I mean, in that sense, we have this world we're trying to understand, and I completely agree with we're such bad co-panelists. I can completely agree with everything that you say about the need to also to really be able to understand that and work quickly. As a question, possibly back to you, Kevin, you had this. You've thought a lot about temporal validity, introducing that as something. I think it's a really great concept to think about some of these things with. But just before that, also the urgency is that just very mundanely, I find it striking that the things that we're talking about are often, it really matters, you know, that we have these big, sometimes very shiny analyses of things that are sort of with these great, this stunningly massive 60 million data set that you're analyzing with these really shiny methods that perhaps, you know, not everyone understands, and they have black box elements. And so quite rightly, we're talking about things that have to do with these, that are coming in with these methods, but also very old questions, which I think you were summarizing very, very nicely. And so we're pushing each other on that. We should be pushing each other much more on that, and also others that are doing similar types of going into these areas to study society and politics with these methods. We're pushing each other on it, and suddenly, you know, I hear myself and others saying things that are these very basic questions that we teach to our students, and you know, they all yawn and fall asleep and want to go to the class that's really about politics, whereas you know, this is so fundamental, and these the sort of work that we're doing, it's a great example of where these really basic questions really matter for pushing our efforts forward.
Thank you. Another question that follows up on what all three of you had said is, does our research process, knowledge production become faster, or is it more burdensome because you mentioned that we need more manual checks, we need to be more careful because there's so much noise in there. Does it become slower? Do we need more funding at the same time? So how would you predict knowledge production? Is it a faster process because we have easy access to data, or on the other hand, is it a slower process because we have more noise, we need more people, we need bigger funds, etc.? So maybe, Julia, you applied for several funds, so maybe you have a good opinion on this.
So I think it might be faster. It might get to some extent cheaper because data is kind of available for free. But then, of course, I mean, we know the rigor is the rigor and it takes time. So I'm not sure whether it will actually become faster.
We need more funds. I'm sure it's a tough sell in this audience, but if anyone has money, they should give it to us. But seriously, I think that the amount of money and the amount of hours that we have as a community is a binding constraint on what we can do. And I think that if we set out to answer questions which are actually not answerable given these constraints, we're going to fail. So I think that a realistic analysis of what we can do is an important step for deciding what we should do. This line of thinking also encourages innovations that make research cheaper. So if the constraints that we have are the number of hours and the number of dollars or euros, sorry, then we should try to make those go farther, right? And so recent innovations on running field experiments where you have pre-treatment and pre-survey measures have been shown, the work by Brockman and Kalla, to decrease the cost of running a gold standard field experiment from $1 million to on the order of 50,000. Right? And so doing that kind of methodological research means that we get 20 times as much knowledge, right? And that, I think, is the margin that we should be thinking about working because of the scope of what we're trying to do. Making everything more efficient and cheaper is one of the most pressing tasks for methodologists or people who want to innovate on theory and thinking about a new way to do a field experiment for cheap. So another example, it's expensive to do a media effects experiment where you show someone like a 3-hour televised debate, right? You have to pay them for 3 hours. But a recent method which says we're going to find people on MTurk who say that they're going to watch the online debate already, and then we randomize some aspect of how they watch the debate, means that we're able to run a field experiment or to deliver a stimulus which is 3 hours long and do so for a fraction of the cost. So I think what we should not do is say, well, we've got a certain amount of money, we want to produce as many papers as possible, so we're going to run as many cheap field survey experiments on MTurk as we can, because that maximizes the papers, right? To run a media effects experiment where you deliver a 15-second stimulus is very cheap, and you can usually make a paper out of that. And as a result, we've got a lot of those papers, and I think that that's not the way we should be deciding what to do.
I also think that it's worth adding that it can be deceptively, one of the problems is that it's deceptively easy to produce sort of shiny research, and that many aspects of the sort of research that we can be doing is, if we're going to be doing it really thoroughly, it's going to take time in the data collection, making sure that the data is robust, understanding the dirt in the data, understanding the context of the data, and so forth. Just that is going to be a big job. Training the neural networks or retraining them to make sure that they work for our purposes, and to make sure that we understand what the network means with what it's doing, and if how do we get it to mean what we want it to mean. All that sort of work is going to take a lot of time if it's done thoroughly and documented properly, and that aspect of the work needs to get more respect. Or sort of, and the respect given the time that it needs to take. So sometimes it has to be slow research.
I wanted to add an even more practical question, because we talked about constraints of us as a science to ask questions and pull the resources in. There's also an individual level constraint, and I think that's for upcoming researchers a good question what to invest in. Because as we learned, we need to tech up somehow, which I guess over the years we have always done, learning new methods, but there's a constraint to that as well. Kevin mentioned Duncan Watts. He has a lab, he has hordes of programmers, and he produces very visible work. He's a great thinker, but surely he needs these programmers. So I wanted to ask, in the process, when you got to questions where you thought, oh, I need this data source, this digital data source, this big data source, what was for you the process to approach that? Did you ask somebody to work with? Did you sit down and try to learn a new programming language? Like, what's the process? How do we get to approaching it as the individual researcher?
So that's a good question. The answer is maybe not the one we all want to hear, which is, so for me personally, I was part of a lab in grad school, a social media lab at NYU. There was a great group of resources where they had dedicated programmers to scrape the data and to, as a community, learn how to analyze the data. So absent that, I wouldn't have been able to do it. I wouldn't have been able to do this research as a grad student. I think the resources have gotten a lot more available in the intervening years, but it's possible that the structure of how we organize science should be different than it is. The question of, as an individual researcher, is kind of begging the question of, is this the right way to organize science? And I think that we're coming from a place where previously it had been possible for individuals to push the margins of science further. Certainly, if you're thinking about political theory, it's plausible to read books by yourself, and then the technology of production of political theory is individual. Formal theory, game theory, these things are all plausibly individual. And it's possible that I think some of Duncan's papers are worth hundreds of other papers. So in terms of the knowledge that is being produced in this lab model, it's just better. And so as an individual researcher, what does that mean? I think, again, we have to reorganize social science to think about this right. So I'm not sure how the institutions differ in various parts of Europe versus my experience in the States, but certainly a longer runway, like the idea of having a PhD student learn all of the theory, all of the stats, all of the coding, all of the substantive material in 3 years and then have publications to get a job is ridiculous. So like, that's just not going to work. I think we all know that, and yet that's what we're supposed to do. So we're up against a bunch of unfortunate constraints.
Can I ask Alexandra here how she came from like a different way of doing understanding the world to using digital data over?
Yeah, so I was thinking about that when preparing for this panel, that I'm a in that sense, I was wondering why you invited me, but then I was thinking that in one way I'm a good person, representative, someone who sort of walked into it backwards. I was pursuing my own research problems. I was really interested in political action and collective action, and my work is an example of where I was sort of forced by my research questions into studying digital media. In the context of digital media, and I was really lucky because I also did get into contact with some sort of collective environments where I could get push things forward. But I would also say, and this is also what we don't want to hear, but since I got tenure, then things changed drastically for me, and I could really pursue things much more creatively in a way that I think is really important. So I do think that the institutional support for this to go in these directions is very important. I think that the security of it, however that's going to happen, but then also the collaborative shared aspect of it, I think is important. So I would endorse that. I would also come back to what you were asking about sort of meta-analyses and which is a different way of approaching this area. To sort of also make sure that we go back and track over what's actually been done, and because there's also a lot of theoretical work that can be done already there in questioning, using the descriptions and the materials that are coming to actually really push our assumptions about what we have and what we already think we know and how we're going forward. So there's actually a lot of theoretical or conceptual work that can be done there as well, which is completely non-technical in that sense.
I think if we talk about uncertainties and how our science community could be reshaped potentially, I'm also wondering how can we balance the act of getting more funds, we need more funds, that was the tenure, and at the same time we want to work with uncertainties, like all these data types have a lot of uncertainties there, and we need to dive into the data, invest a lot of manpower in order to find out where the noise is, etc. So there is so much investment up front before we can apply for something. So I wonder, how can we, maybe the shiny apps balance for this somehow, but how can we work in this constrained funding situation? I think there are few funds that allow for exploration of the data, but this is very rare, and mostly these are quite small. How can we convince big funders to fund our uncertain explorative research projects?
So as luck would have it, we also have the scholarly societies that we can also consider about how can scholarly societies such as ECPR think about these problems. So what are our collective efforts that we can do in the community to also help develop the questions? I could also add that this is one thing that this is one thing that is my third point about resistance, actually exposing how difficult this work is, and how that's not just a matter of us sort of, academics arguing with each other and criticizing each other, but it's actually about producing the type of, this type of, the output from this type of work. And so it's not just it's not just that we're slow and arguing about everything, it's that this is what we need to be doing to be producing this kind of work. And that actually that's something that applies also to attempts to do this outside of the academy, and to really show that, demonstrate that, I think is important.
The definition of outcome, I think, is a bit different now. Yeah.
Just wanted to follow up on something Kevin said before, and I want to hear what Julia has to say about that, because Kevin said maybe we should forgo the idea of replication as a standard in social sciences. for me as an experimentalist, that's hard to swallow. So would be interested to hear what Julia has to say about that.
Well, I mean, I agree. I should say I agree with Kevin, but this is not to say that we can't, in a sense, try to replicate the stuff while having a different expectation, right? So this can be valuable and insightful in itself. Like the Twitter bot example is pretty like self-explanatory, I think, and so I would very much agree with what Kevin said. Yeah. I don't know whether I should further elaborate. So I think what we should generally try more is also to build on others' experimental results and advance them. And the current incentive structure is not like that. And replication or adding on some existing experimental work would be one way to go about it. Yeah.
I have one follow-up question, Julia, on your replication perspective, because often working with these big data sources, we either, or that was my experience, buying some firm data in a context of a big fund or having some text data from an archive that you're not able to publish the raw data. So there we really have sharp constraints on showing all our research process. So how can we ensure replicability in this context? What are the tools here?
This is hard, this is challenging. What currently, especially in the field of AI, is being advanced as one line of, or as one solution out of this, is to relying on synthetic data. So basically the same goes for data anonymization. So to generate data that is as close to the data that you originally used for the analysis, but anonymized with regards to certain respects. So, and that's a very exciting research agenda, and it goes into the same direction as what I said earlier, that we shouldn't consider synthetic data just as a subject of research in social media studies, but also a tool for research or for reproducibility of results.
Yeah, so these ideas are very helpful, and the idea of differential privacy was sort of invented by Facebook in order to share a bunch of their data with people as part of the Social Science One project. But then 6 months or a year after that data was released, it turned out there was an error in it. And we were unable to verify this data. The Facebook gave us data, and then they were like, oh, that was a mistake in that. I mean, it turns out this one was not the worst error. But in general, that's not a great pipeline for people who are trying to hold companies like Facebook to account. So clearly we need access to more data. And so government action on this front seems necessary. It's very unclear how that's supposed to work, what it's supposed to be. But I think that continuing to advocate for data access is essential to balancing these needs for privacy, but also verifiability, replicability.
Thank you so much for answering our questions and for the starting discussion, but we want to give you the chance to ask questions, to make comments hidden behind a question, or to just criticize the panelists for what they've said. We have a microphone here, I think. So if you want to say something, ask a question, please raise your hand. If you feel shy, you can also go on Zoom and type in that in the chat function, but I think we preferred if you would just speak up.
But
So
also for the virtual audience, of course, please post some questions here.
please come straight in comments.
Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. It's really thought-provoking, and definitely there's quite a lot of questions and ideas and so on. So my question is more related with, I guess something what Kevin said, about are you asking the right questions, and kind of thinking about the big question of are we actually, and I'm thinking about the question of are we looking at the right things, because what we look into is basically online behavior, what people do and online, but obviously this has implications with the real world, with the offline world on the one hand, and I'm not sure how we could square this sort of relationship between offline world and online world, which is, I think, something quite an important relationship. I mean, we tend to talk about obviously the implications of online behavior on offline world, but the other way around is something that I mean, I personally believe is something to look into, and this is the relationship to my question. And the second one is definitely related with something that the last thing that again Kevin mentioned about ownership, data ownership, and the fact that I mean, Facebook and actually private companies generally are a huge gatekeeper to online access. And I mean, initially I was thinking of asking whether we should push forward for more government regulation, or in order to ensure access, but also this also leads to another, I guess, issue or problem that currently we as academic scientists have, and this is this sort of assault that is being made on academic freedom, from people who are talking about protecting academic freedom, but actually making the wanting to restrict to it. And one of their claims is about academic scientists being actually biased, political, and that sort of stuff. So how could we actually square those things, those two things? On the one hand, pushing for example, government regulation, which is definitely getting into into the policy, I guess, political debate on the one hand, but also on the other hand, avoiding being branded as partisan, political, getting involved into this sort of messy stuff that can happen. So thank you.
All right, so the first question, I appreciate you correcting yourself and not saying real world, right? So that's fair. But let me say that even the premise of the question, I think, illustrates that online behavior is not being taken fully seriously yet. So Dominik, you do games like this kind of experiments, right? And do people ask you questions like, well, what are the implications of this for online behavior?
Also do games online.
Sure.
You mean like social media behavior?
Right. Or do you generally get to just study this?
I studied more abstractly in collective action problems, which I'm sure have applications online, like who's signing up for petition, who's giving money to school, matched funds to schools. So there are, I could generate implications for online behavior. That's right.
Right, but this is still an area of inquiry on its own terms, right? And I think that we should take online behavior as an area of inquiry on its own terms. Indeed, we ultimately do want to link all of our areas of inquiry. But I think that this is a sufficiently important thing that we should just study it without immediately trying to tack it back onto specific offline behaviors, which, I mean, I'm a little defensive about this as someone who's been studying online behavior since a grad student and was like, oh, is this political science? I mean, thankfully, Trump came along and now everyone's like, oh yeah, this is definitely political science. So, but anyway, a little defensive. The second question, you want to go ahead? Right, yes, that's exactly right. And this is, I think, a very, very challenging question. And I think it does basically require rethinking the relationship between technocracy, democracy, and populism. Like, this is clearly an actual topic in politics. And I think that part of the problem as scientists is thinking of ourselves as outside of the scope of politics. And that, in fact, in the US, and from my experience, academic expertise is explicitly politicized. And I think that it's no longer really realistic, and was never realistic for social scientists with any amount of power in the world, to think of ourselves as completely outside of the scope of politics. But I do think that the question of technocracy and modern democracy is very unsettled. And this is like a open problem for political theory and for citizen activism.
Good morning. Thanks very much for a really interesting presentation and talk. My name is Theresa Kuhn. I'm from the University of Amsterdam. I have two questions. One is to Kevin, because I think as many others in the room, I was a bit intrigued by your plea to forget about replication. And not only because of, everything we've learned, but also I think because you brought the example of Facebook, which changes over time, obviously. But I think so many other things also have changed over time, and especially across countries. I mean, many of us here in the room are comparativists, and we then all know, okay, for example, if we look at the impact of education on political attitudes, we know this might work in one way in one political system at a given time, but it works very differently in a different political system in a different time. And actually by doing replication or by checking whether it works in different contexts, different times, we actually, I think, can really learn a lot about the mechanisms underlying these relationships. So wouldn't actually replication there be something, and the failure to replicate be something that would teach us a lot about what we're actually studying? But that's the first question. The other one is more for the general audience. So of course, not everybody is as fortunate as you to have done their PhD in a lab. So what would you, and that's for all three of you, recommend to graduate students today who are maybe more in an individual program? What kind of methods should they now really prioritize? What kind of software should they learn? So I would be curious to hear from you. Thanks.
So yes, this is definitely intentionally provocative. But the reason I say this is that I think that the original sin of behavioral science is to think that we're a natural science. And so I'm trying to emphasize the fact that we're not a natural science, but we can still be a science, and we should set up our own standards for what we do. And replication means performing the same procedure and getting the same result. And I think that the phrase performing the same procedure makes sense if you're mixing chemicals in a test tube. There's enough that is fixed about the world. The ceteris paribus assumption makes sense. When you try to replicate an experiment in one country and another country, a lot of things are different. I would say, in fact, that that's not a replication, that you're not really performing the same procedure, because there are a lot of different factors which could possibly be causally relevant. So I think that what you were describing, I am in support of. I would not call it replication, because the idea of replication to me means the original finding either holds up or it doesn't hold up. What we're doing, I think, is learning about the scope conditions of a given finding. We're learning about the extent to which it is generalizable. And I think that we're trying to generate generalizable findings. And this is ultimately a semantic discussion, but we sort of have a, again, fixed amount of money to spend on things. And so if we're going to run 1,000 experiments, to me, the replication paradigm means run 100 of them where almost everything is the same, because we're trying to find out whether or not this one thing is the same or not across all of these contexts. The other approach is to randomize everything we can in order to try to find out what's happening. And this gets back to the philosophy of science, inductive versus deductive. Frankly, my perspective in favor of inductivism at this margin is that I don't think we have sufficiently well-developed theories to be doing the, allocate all of our money to a certain number of theories, and that I think that we should be looking around more broadly. But this is an active, open area of discussion.
Julia, in terms of replication? The second question is, what should grad students learn and do?
So I think, the temptation is big, right? To just learn whatever is currently used most heavily in social science. And to some extent, grad students have to fall for that temptation simply because that's what later on the job market requires of them. But I think, so a general strategy or general advice I would give to any grad student is to rely on open source software, because that's, in the end of the day, we've been speaking about funding and so on, because I think that's really where the discipline has to move from. It also liberates you as a researcher, and on top of it, it increases the amount of possibilities that you have. For instance, when designing online experiments, like if you rely on the pre-built tools that are given to you by commercial survey software, right, then you're constrained by that. And I think just out of principle, we shouldn't let ourselves constrain to ask these questions that we can ask by these these pre-given tools. So that's something I would suggest to any researcher. And that, of course, if you rely on open source software, oftentimes comes with an extra challenge in programming, simply because that, I mean, to some extent, you have to use or start using the command line if you rely on tools that are open source and that don't come with a user interface that feels very comfortable to you in the first place. But it allows you to be flexible, and it increases the amount of possibilities that you have. So that's a general advice that, if any general advice, I would share that one, yeah.
And I would completely endorse that, to go for the programming, but also to remember that you're, or to at least understand it enough, right? You know, but also to accept that you're not going to be able to do everything, and so you to try to get out of the isolation, to go find the research networks, and in the ones that are, because this is such an early area, there are several who are extremely welcoming to graduate students, with a lot of empathy and sympathy for the fact that it's going to be very difficult to do it on your own. And if you're starting off, you know, those of us who sort of walked into it backwards, the frustration of sitting for ages and ages and ages, making some simple mistake that, you know, in a collective environment, somebody could have just helped you on with, you know, so you want to be able to find the networks that can make you less alone and less isolated.
Hi, thanks so much for this excellent panel. My name is Emilia Palonen. I'm a program director in datafication at the University of Helsinki currently. And I wanted to ask you, as a follow-up to the previous conversation, about like what's the responsibility of universities and like scholarly communities in developing these open source software, because we know that the internet was invented at university, and then it seems that we have like lost that ethos of contributing. Instead, our universities want us to like get some build something that is purchasable and can add value to the university, and like monetary value. So how do you feel as the new generation, especially what's the role of ourselves in developing those tools further? And my original question, I would have several, of course, but was that now that we are in a political science conference, what do you think about interdisciplinarity, and which are the disciplines that you would look to currently, also in humanities and social sciences, for like collaboration in this theme? Thanks.
So unfortunately, on the question of open source software development, I wouldn't advise grad students to do it because it's insufficiently rewarded. It's very difficult, and that's tragic. But this is the reality that we live in. I agree that it's extremely useful for the community to do this. However, realistically, as a grad student, you're better off trying to publish papers. So this means that having more senior people spending time doing this would be great, or changing the way that we talk about credit in order to incentivize these kind of things. But at present, I think a lot of the people who are best suited to do this should not be doing it.
I would also add to that in my experience working with people who are focused on the open source software development and sharing, which can be sort of a focus in itself. It's also the case that sometimes I feel like it needs to be worked through much more thoroughly. You know, you need to get to the analyses, right, and do it to understand what needs to be tweaked in there. So it can be a longer process of updating and so forth that you know, a graduate student especially doesn't have time for. And I agree with you that the credit isn't often given in that way. In terms of interdisciplinarity, I think that is something that we really do need to be open to, and with all the challenges that brings with it. But I think we need to look beyond the social sciences to, for example, computer science, to in that respect. Within the human and social sciences, I'm not sure I would pick out one that was particularly, it depends on what you're trying to do. you know, because there's in my own work, of course, the media and communication, but also, for example, art history are giving really important input.
Just to add a quick remark here, I think it's on the one hand very useful to work with disciplines that are fond of working with this type of data, but on the other hand, my experience also has shown that it's very challenging to work with disciplines that are more qualitatively driven or have a bit of a different perspective on data. But I think it's a huge gain if we work with people that have a more detailed look on things and really want to assess the noise and understand it. I think it is very challenging for quantitative researchers to work with these people, but on the other hand, a project can advance. In my opinion, we have this manual checks constantly, and I think it's a huge win. So on both sides, like the more fancy disciplines, but also those that work with more traditional tools. There was one more question in the back. Oh, Julia, do you want to add something?
The way I understand it, this is not at all my topic, so this is really layman's point of view. But so I understand there's really two kind of problems we're discussing here, and correct me if I'm wrong. The first is more macro or political in the sense of the way science is organized. You know, we produce knowledge, but it is produced in a very individualistic way. We do not, we do collaborate a little bit, but not as much. We all want to be recognized individually. And so part of the solution or of the revolution would be, I don't know, a sort of party of political insight and social scientists who have representatives in parliament, so they will have more funding, and they would be fighting among each other to see what we'd be researching. And I suppose that won't happen immediately. But then both of you said, you know, we need to do more qualitative or descriptive work. And this is where I might sound very naive, but isn't, I mean, in social sciences and anthropology, we've been doing this for a lot of time. Is there scope for, I don't know, digital anthropology or social science ethnography? Because I don't believe we need to have, and then again, correct me if I'm wrong, huh? I don't believe we need to have all of the data before we can start understanding and analyzing it. So maybe instead of, you know, wanting to scrape all the data there is, you know, too much knowledge also makes it difficult to then understand what we're dealing with. So I just wanted to know more about, you know, maybe that perspective. Thanks.
That's a really great question. And I think that we're saying saying several different things at the same time, perhaps. And one of them is, sure, there's a need for triangulation where you have big data, but you also need to take, perhaps not in the same research project, or perhaps in the same research project, taking in the analyses and the knowledge that's being done by completely sort of small scale studies, including ethnographic. So I think that that is a very important thing to remember. We need to remember when we don't need to do big data research, because it's not going to get us what we need, and we also, because other ways are simpler and better and richer and getting this at the question we're trying to get at. So one of the things moving forward is to keep open to the triangulation in sort of the big and the small sense. I also think that one of the things that I think is overlooked is that when doing big data research, using, for example, deep learning, what is not appreciated is the amount of really interpretive skills, quite specifically about the concepts that you're trying to develop, how you're trying to get them, and in encoding and so forth, that are involved, and that you need. That's a skill you need. There's a contribution to be made by people who actually understand how to think about that sort of thing. So that's the one thing I would make. And then I think your comments about sort of the need for description is also a third point. Yeah.
Briefly, yeah, qualitative description is also extremely important. We definitely need digital ethnography. That's great. I think the way those two questions intersect, though, is that quantitative skill is increasingly the language of power. And social science, academic social science, has to justify our existence to funders. And ethnography is phenomenal, but anthropology as a discipline is sort of on the decline funding-wise. And we have to think about how to maintain our relevance in society. This is not a great thing to think about. It's not a pleasant thing to think about. But this is a constraint on our ability to do science, is our ability to justify ourselves to the rest of society that we should have this role, right? And so I wish we had more digital ethnography. Some of the Bella Coleman, Dana Boyd have done great work on this, but there's not enough of it. And I think the challenge is to justify this to funders. So these two things are related.
I think there was a question over here, and then we go over there where the microphone is.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elena from Trento. I would like to apologize because I've lost the habit of talking in front of people and seeing like people staring at me. So it's kind of hard. So, but thank you all for these presentations. I find them very inspiring. And I think that I learned a lot more intensely about what we lack. Training, imagination, insofar as we always ask the same question to this new data. We lack autonomy, we lack funds. But regardless of this, I think we've done so far a pretty good job in turning, this scarcity of resources into a new discipline that has deep roots, but it's growing very high. So, I mean, I think we're part of a great collective endeavor here. And I think we should recognize that as much as we recognize the lacks. But my question is, I really do have an issue with this idea that we have to find one Kepler that is exploring a solar system or a planet system, which is our collective planet system, because I don't think that we're destined to find just one system. There are so many. And the point is, where is this huge telescope guiding our gaze? So my question to all three of you is that before it is too late already, are we ready to turn this engagement with visibility that big data research is giving us into a new form of a political sociology or political science of absence, where we recognize that beside what it's visible and that we are understanding so quickly and in an amazing way that there are invisibilities and absences that do not speak to the total reality. So how can we do that? Are we ready to do that? Are we ready to take the responsibility that identifying absences, it is a political statement, following up to what Alexandra was saying, because we've been shielding us with this veil of objectivity, with this huge amount of data techniques, and that is awesome. I feel much stronger since I walked into this field, and I love it. But we're missing so much, and there is so much that we're not looking because there's so much that this data are not capturing. So are we ready to do this before it's too late?
Sure. So to the first half of this, I think that's exactly right. It's extremely impressive what we've done. I feel like academic panels, we should all pat ourselves on the back. We've done a really good job. So that's great. I mean, seriously, I do also feel much more powerful. It's extremely empowering to teach grad students that, like, you don't have any data now, and after this semester, I'm going to teach you how to scrape these tweets, and then you can analyze the text of those tweets, and then you can have a data set that never existed before, that you did. I think that's awesome, and I think it is extremely, that's why so many people are into it. I mean, clearly, this resonates, so I apologize for focusing too much on the negative. So, Kepler wasn't the end of describing the solar system, and I think it's fair to say that we need to be extremely aware of the limitations of our data sets. And I think that the idea of a realm of human behavior is certainly a mistake. I think that objectivity in general is not a useful frame. There are many different subjectivities that we can get at through the use of big data. Each of them provides a lens on the human world. And I think that the desire to combine data from different data sets reflects the necessity of triangulating between, we have these different devices that we have to give us information about the social world, none of them reveals reality. Each of them reveals something about the human behavior that we're trying to study. And absolutely, to date, too much of the research on social media has focused on a single platform. And not enough of it is looking at the whole of even a single human's behavior across the internet, which seems like a pretty reasonable thing to try to get at, but we don't really have a good way of doing so yet. And so, to your point, I think that perhaps we have overclaimed thus far. I'm willing to say that's probably right. But I think that we are trying to get better about this. And I think that to your first point, we have made a lot of progress and it's very encouraging. So.
Oh, just to say that it's an excellent point, and I think that it's one is embracing the textures of what we can, variety of what we can do is important. But I think what you're also speaking to is one of the questions they had for, in the description of the panel, how can we be good academic citizens now that, we're moving in this direction? And one of those might be an obligation to actually use this also to seek out the margins and the differences and yeah. So I think that captures that.
Thank you very much. I have to warn you, this is going to be the last question, but I'm sure you guys are also going to hang out for a few minutes more if there are more pressing questions, but we're coming up against noon. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Luca Verstegen from the University of Gothenburg. Thanks to the five of you. I have a question on theory, which sounds a bit weird on a big data panel here, but I was wondering, you mentioned that social sciences still have to improve their theorizing, that there aren't grand theories, or that we're still in the stage of developing theories, not so much testing in big data, perhaps. And I was wondering, what do you expect from social science theory that we can move to the testing stage, actually? So what are perhaps also, if you compare that to natural sciences, what do we need in theories that can, as social sciences, make really confident that now we can test the theory because it's been sufficiently developed? Does that even work? Thank you.
So I think the big difference is the idea of the severity of the test. So the idea of, I think the example is from Einstein predicted the wavelength of the redshift to within like a very, very tight margin. And if it had been a little bit different, then his theory would have been wrong, right? And that's just not how any of our stuff works, right? We're like, oh, it's greater than 0.05. That means our theory is right, or something like this. So the idea of a severe test of making a very specific prediction, which if it's wrong, actually tells us that the theory is wrong, is, I think, necessary and extremely difficult in social science.
I think we should conclude at this moment, and also maybe a last word on if you want to have something as a suggestion or whatever. I think the panel itself pointed out to many challenges, but at the same time, it also inspired all of us to do the hard work and to move forward and make things better, given these new opportunities that we have. So maybe if you have something to add, feel free, and otherwise we close with this.
The one thing I would want to say is that we've talked a lot about digital media, and because those are examples that are close to us, and also it's an important field today, but that the general discussion or the area contains so much more. And I think that's one of the things that is, for me, so incredibly exciting about it, that there are different sources and different angles and perspectives that even, for a researcher such as ourselves in digital media and politics to be able to get at. And there are excellent examples of research in the big data paradigm going into new empirical phenomena, but it's also the case that there's excellent examples where the data sources have been able to really give new perspectives on old phenomena and questions. So I think it's important to emphasize that.
So yeah, I feel like have been somewhat pessimistic, and on the question of what an individual grad student should do, I would say definitely do this. It's like really fun, it's really exciting, and the chance of getting a good job in some way is much higher if you study these kind of things than if you don't. So I think that despite all the challenges, it's eminently worth it. And even if you don't have a huge community at your own university, there's this community now, and there's these all sorts of opportunities to meet people to work with online and offline. So just don't be discouraged.
Yeah, I think what we can also, as researchers, in a sense, contribute, I think the disciplines or the progress, the technological progress will move faster with outside of academia. That's, in a sense, by definition. But what we can really contribute as researchers is to follow up on a question that has been asked on qualitative description, describe and analyze also the biases that exist and expose them. Because if we don't do it, it's unlikely that someone else will do it. So that's also something we should, as social scientists, take in a sense as a challenge or as an obligation, maybe even.
And with that note, I wish you all a great week and great inspiring projects on using big data. Thank you.